It's time for marketing that does more. Enhance your brand sustainability and customer loyalty with nature-based campaigns. Forest Bridge, where trees meet trust. Visit forest-bridge.com. That's forest-bridge.com to connect.
All right, Definers, we have an atypical episode to start the year off. We're focusing on Uproot Project, which is a network by and for environmental journalists of color that also supports students and others aspiring to cover the environmental beat. So the Uproot Project, it's open to journalists of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds, but its goal is to uplift and support journalists of color who have been underrepresented in the journalism industry for far too long.
You'll hear in a minute from Lucia Priselac, founding director at Uproot Project, about the many things they are doing to support environmental journalists of color. Now, if you're thinking this sounds familiar, you're not wrong. We've mentioned the Uproot Project before, specifically in our 2022 Holiday Hodgepodge episode, where we said you could donate to them as a sustainable gift idea.
And speaking of donating, we're hoping that after hearing from Lucia, you'll be so moved to support their important work by donating at uprootproject.org. And to spur donations, the Sustainability Defined podcast, with all its financial might, is offering up to a $500 donation match. So just email us your receipt. So go to uprootproject.org, donate whatever you feel comfortable with. Email us, hosts, HOSTS, at sustainabilitydefined.com. And then we'll go ahead and donate whatever amount you donated to Uproot Project, and then thus your impact is doubled.
And folks, beyond the donation match and this episode's interview with Lucia, when we take breaks later this year, our plan is to play podcast content from one of the environmental journalists of color within Uproot Project's network. So a whole slew of cool things going on here, Scott.
Win, win, win.
Bingo.
Isn't that what Michael Scott says?
Yeah.
Okay, so we hope you enjoyed this interview with Lucia, and we'll see you in March for an episode with our normal format, and it'll be focused on carbon removal. So see you then, and in the meantime, you all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We'll see you next time. Attention responsible brands. Are you facing the challenge of gaining true recognition for your sustainability efforts? Forest Bridge is here to help guide you through a transformative journey in the heart of the markets you serve. Visit forest-bridge.com. Again, that's forest-bridge.com to plant trees, better your city, and build brand trust. We understand the frustration of hitting internal sustainability goals without seeing a positive shift in brand perception. Forest Bridge combines expertise in ad tech, project management, and environmental engineering to provide you with a novel and impactful experience. Book a call on forest-bridge.com for a tailored tree planting design and marketing plan. Watch your trees and marketing ROI grow by creating nature-based memories with your brand. Let's break through the noise and build an authentic community capable of bringing more nature to our cities and increasing your customer loyalty. Forest Bridge, where trees meet trust. All right, Definers, we are so excited to be joined now by Lucia Priselac. She is the founding director of the Uproot Project. Lucia, thanks so much for joining us. We are so excited to talk with you.
I'm excited to be here.
So, Lucia, let's start with just the basics of the Uproot Project. We know that Uproot Project was established to address an urgent gap, that being the lack of representation of journalists of color in newsrooms across the country, covering communities that are hit first and hardest by the climate crisis. So, Lucia, you created this network of journalists of color covering the environment. How exactly does Uproot Project support this network and address this gap?
We support this network in a variety of ways, and through those ways, address this gap. I think the biggest way that we really support this network is bringing environmental journalists of color together in a safe space where they are able to ask questions, they are able to ask for help, they are able to vent their frustrations about the journalism industry and specifically the environmental beat. But along with that, Uproot is able to provide trainings for journalists ranging from journalists who are just starting out or J school students to seasoned vet journalists as well. We are able to support their work, whether it be publishing in our biweekly newsletter, The Seedling, and being able to pay them to write that seedling, but also feature their work, highlighting them on social media, and really bringing attention to these environmental journalists of color who are writing these incredible stories and are covering these communities that are historically underserved and underrepresented in the media, and really making sure that not just these communities are hearing these stories and understanding how they're impacted by the climate crisis, but the world at large.
So, Lucia, the Uproot Project, our understanding is it started after a conversation that GRIST convened summer 2019 with a diverse group of environmental journalists for a candid conversation about the challenges that were being faced in the environmental journalism field. And so Uproot Project launched in March 2021. You became founding director in February 2022. So were you the first founding director? Like, what was happening between the launching and you becoming founding director? And then tell us about your journey to this role. You got a master's at University of Edinburgh. I studied abroad there, so we can talk a bit about Edinburgh if you like, but also your earlier roles at GRIST.
Of course. I started at GRIST in 2020 as their special projects manager. And one of the special projects that I was managing was this kind of cohort of environmental journalists of color that GRIST had brought together and had decided to start forming and supporting this network. And at the time, it was just called the Environmental Journalists of Color Network. So I started working with them just kind of in a support capacity. And then our director of programming went on parental leave, and I kind of took over this network. From there, it kind of snowballed into the Uproot Project. We decided on the name and what we wanted Uproot to be, and we really wanted it to be first and foremost a network. We wanted it to be a place where people could find this support and we could provide the safe space. So then once we launched in March 2021, I was kind of doing this unofficial dual role as the project manager for the Uproot Project, while also performing some of the executive director type functions, just because they needed to get done and somebody needed to do them. And our steering committee at the time was made up of all working journalists, which our board currently is. So they did not have the time and capacity to step into that executive function. So I just kind of took it on unofficially. And as we were growing at a very quick rate, which was amazing, we very quickly realized that we needed an official director in this role. I didn't automatically just step into this role. We were kind of looking for someone to fill it. And as we were talking about what we were looking for and the type of person we wanted to be the director, I realized that I was already doing that and I filled that role.
Yeah.
So that's why there's a little bit of a gap between when the Uproot Project launched and I became their founding director. So yes, I am the first director of the Uproot Project, the founding director of the organization.
Very cool. And one thing you mentioned was your board is all working journalists, and that's still the case, you said?
Yes, our board is made up of all working journalists or people who have a journalism background or work in different aspects of the journalism profession.
How is that beneficial to the mission of Uproot Project to have only working journalists or people supporting journalists on the board?
It's incredibly valuable because since we are an organization for and by environmental journalists of color, our board, being working environmental journalists of color for the most part, are able to tell us what gaps they're seeing as they are in their newsrooms, they're out reporting. And then we can really take that knowledge and that hands-on experience and translate it into what we do to support the journalists in our network.
Got it. And I think, so Brady Walkinshaw, who was formerly of GRIS, he's now CEO of Earth Alliance, we had him on a show about climate advocacy. He was still the CEO when you were doing all this, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And so, Lucia, before we shine the spotlight a little bit more directly on Uproot, I do want to just refocus on something you said, because, Scott, we put out an episode on careers and sustainability, and I think one of these common questions is, how do you break into the type of role in sustainability that you're really kind of yearning for? And I think, Lucia, you have a really powerful example, which is, look, like, even if your current title maybe wasn't in place when you started working on this particular project in earnest, you just dove in with both hands and watched this thing evolve into what now looks like a fantastic role. So I think your story is a really fantastic example for all those folks listening out there wondering the same type question.
I think my story is also a bit unique because I didn't go to J school. I didn't study journalism or environmental studies at all in my undergrad or my master's. I kind of fell into journalism after I graduated from grad school, and then really fell in love with working in what I call journalism operations, and then was lucky enough to be hired at Grist and really kind of carved this little area of environmental journalism out for myself. I couldn't be more grateful that everything ended up the way that it has so far.
And J school is like school of journalism, like getting a master's in journalism, just for people that aren't familiar with that. Okay.
Not to be confused with my school, which I run on the side. Okay. So Lucia, let's dive into the Uproot Project database, which I know is a critical resource for journalists who are seeking to connect with editors, mentors, experts, sources, and other journalists of color within the environmental space. So could you give us an example of this database facilitating connections with journalists of color, all within this environmental beat?
Yes, I can. We actually have a great example of a freelancer who was in our network who had been looking for work and had been posting on different freelance journalism job boards and just wasn't able to make a connection to really foster her freelance career. And then we launched the database and she joined and she indicated that she was available for freelancing. And somebody had reached out to her and they specifically noted that they found her through the Uproot Project database. They were looking for an environmental journalist of color with her specific background, and they had just been combing through different kind of message sites asking, hey, is anybody interested or available? But having the Uproot database and the way that we've curated it, where you can say that you're available for freelancing, you can say what your subject matter expertise is, what you're comfortable writing on, really allowed this editor to find our member and the specific fit that she was looking for in one place. And it was just a really heartwarming and validating kind of testimonial from our member, because we thought that the database is something that was missing in the space, but then hearing that she was only able to find freelance work through our database, but she was the perfect fit for every freelance job that she found through that database, was just really enlightening and validating.
Okay, and I imagine with this database, you don't have everyone on it that is environmental journalists of color, but do you have a sense of how many total journalists are out there covering the environment, and what % of those are BIPOC, and how that's changing over time? Is that something you all are tracking and measuring?
We aren't currently tracking it as the Uproot Project, but we always kind of have a finger on the pulse of reports that do come out that are tracking information like this. Like, there was a great Pew Research study that came out in 2023 that highlighted the fact that 84% of the environmental beat is still white, which is a really staggering number, especially in 2023. And I know it's really hard sometimes to categorize the environmental beat because it's such an intersectional beat. You can cover the environment in almost any other type of beat, like the investigative beats, even sports that you're reporting on. So it's really hard to categorize just the environmental beat, but still having that number and knowing that in 2023, the environmental beat is still 84% white doesn't really seem like a lot has been changing. And that's something that we are really working to to move that needle and make sure that we are helping increase the pipeline of young environmental journalists of color into newsrooms, but then also making sure that newsrooms have the support structure to maintain and support those journalists of color as well.
Okay, so that Pew statistic, 84% of journalists on the environmental beat are white. That gives us a sense of the broader scope of environmental journalists. But what about the journalists specifically in the Uproot Project network? Can you tell us how many are involved and where they're located?
We are actually 600 plus strong at the Uproot Project, which is really incredible for an organization that launched in 2021, that we've grown so quickly and we continue to grow, which is really incredible. And kind of an unintentional side effect of our quick growth is that we have become an international organization. We have journalists from all over North America, many African countries, Europe, and also some Asian countries as well, which wasn't something that we initially planned for or even thought was something that could happen. But knowing that our work is meaningful enough that members from all over the world want to come and experience the support of the Uproot Project is just really cool.
Well, I hope this means fun international travel for you as a result with this international expansion here. But also, I got to be honest, I thought the number was going to be lower. I didn't even know there were 600 journalists on covering the environment, period, like specifically.
Well, we do have membership tiers. So not everyone in the Uproot Project is a working journalist. We do have individuals who work in journalism operations, communication, PR.
Okay.
But those members we value just as much because they're able to share job openings with our network and other types of support for our network as well, which just helps us continue to grow the pipeline of journalists of color into newsrooms.
Got it. I love it. And is there something going forward that you're particularly excited about that either Uproot Project is doing or that you're supporting or just seeing out there that you think is going to move the needle?
I think one of the things that specifically the Uproot Project is doing is that we host a year-long environmental journalism fellowship where we take about 7 environmental journalists of color from our network who have all applied for this fellowship. And we are able to give them up to $2,000 to report on an environmental journalism story that they otherwise would not have the resources to tell. Our fellows, they were able to place some of their stories in publications like Vox, AP, and just giving them the resources to be able to tell the stories that they want to be able to tell about these communities and these climate impact stories from an environmental journalist of color that really needs to be told by an environmental journalist of color is something that we're really proud to be able to do. Another thing that Uproot does is we had our second year this year of an event series called Journey of a Story, where we highlight environmental journalists of color in our network, and they explain why it is so important to have diverse perspectives in environmental journalism and why a certain story that they reported could only be told in this way by an environmental journalist of color. And we hosted a series in 2023 that highlighted Indigenous journalists of color who work in the climate space and really just highlighting their voices and being able to share them with a wider audience to make people understand and see, one, that there are so many diverse perspectives, and two, why they're important.
Well, I think that's fantastic, Lucia. And on top of that, not only is your fellowship allowing these stories to be told by journalists of color, but you're also, sounds like, just giving a phenomenal opportunity to these younger journalists as they're building their own careers.
That is one of Uproot's kind of pillars, is to see the next generation of environmental journalists of color. So it is very important to us to be able to support them in whatever way we are able to.
And is there any of these stories that were told that otherwise would not have been because of these fellowships? Is there one you want to tell us about that you felt like was particularly illuminating?
I can't remember specific stories off the top of my head, just because we have a few classes of fellows now, but I can tell you a couple people to watch who I really enjoyed watching their story come to life through our fellowship. Mm-hmm. One is Cameron Oglesby. She is an environmental justice advocate, ecologist, artist, and multimedia storyteller. She was part of our inaugural class of fellows in 2022, and it was just really fun to watch her story come together and hear about her process. And then also another member of our inaugural class of fellows is Chantel Riley. We also featured her in our first ever Journey of a Story, and she sat on a panel for us. She's a freelance health and science writer, but she's been published in PBS, Vice, Washington Post magazine, among other publications as well. And her storytelling is really passionate, and she gets really deep into the communities that she reports on.
All right, Lucia. So on top of just perusing your website, which is uprootproject.org, the question is, for listeners wanting to keep in touch with Uproot Project, we saw that there was the Seedling, which is your bi-weekly newsletter that keeps your members up to speed on all things Uproot. So perhaps listeners can sign up for that. Anything else listeners should be on the lookout for as far as keeping up with your organization?
Yes, definitely the Seedling. It's incredible. We have a different Uproot member write the Seedling each time. So it's a very personal account of the theme that we're covering in the Seedling, as well as just links to different stories that we want to highlight, stories that our newsletter writer of that issue wants to highlight that they've written. We love the Seedling. We love that we are able to, one, support our members by paying them to write it, but also share out their lovely work. We also have an Uproot blog called Field Notes that gets published the third Friday of every month. And it's a week in the life of an environmental journalist of color, because we really wanted to highlight that every environmental journalist of color is different in the way that they live their life and the way that they tell their stories. So I would also really recommend checking out Field Notes. It's on our website under our content tab, if that interests you as well. And then following us on social media, our Instagram, TikTok, Threads, X, formerly known as Twitter. We're all at Uproot Project on those as well.
Jay, they're on the TikTok.
I've heard of it.
We are not. And Field Notes, yeah, I want to check that out. And that's cool that you pay the people on the network to write the Seedling. That's like the opposite of an AI-generated newsletter. So that's good.
It's really important to us that if we have someone doing any type of work for us, we are able to pay them a fair rate for their work, and they're able to produce some incredibly personal and moving stories through it.
And I imagine, Lucia, that the only way you're able to do that is if people donate. And so I'm going to use that as the setup to encourage listeners to donate. We mentioned at the intro to this episode that we are matching up to $500. Anyone who donates to Uproot Project, just email hosts, HOSTS, at sustainabilitydefined.com, the receipt from your donation, and then we'll go ahead and match it. But beyond donating and following Field Notes, signing up for the Seedling, is there anything else the listeners can do to support your work beyond the donating?
Definitely interacting with our social media. The more people interact with our social media, the more people that we are able to reach. And that means the more potential members that we are able to bring into our network and support and be able to offer these opportunities that we have for them. Also, if you see that the Uproot Project is doing a virtual event, you are free to attend. The majority of our events aren't closed to the public. They're open to anyone who wants to join them. And I think that attending an Uproot Project event, especially if you're not really familiar with environmental issues or diversity and inclusion, could be a really great introduction to why that is important in the environmental journalism space. And, just bringing it back around might make you more likely to donate to the Uproot Project in the future.
I love it. Well, our plan is to highlight the work of the journalists in your network, particularly when we're on breaks, and hopefully play some podcast episodes from them. So we're excited about that. We're excited about the donations. We're so glad you were able to join us today, and hope our listeners, our definers, check out your website, check out all the things you mentioned, donate, and we look forward to keeping in touch and continuing to support you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Lucia.